Jeffrey Tucker is a world-renowned author, the director of content for the Foundation for Economic Education, the founder of Liberty.me, and a distinguished honorary member of Mises Brazil. Jeffrey Tucker sat down with Wisconsin International Radio to discuss a variety of topics. All right, joined here today with author Jeffrey Tucker. Thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
First off, tell me a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, where you went to school, a little bit about how you got involved in the liberty movement.
My family has been in Texas since about 1832, so I have a long history there in southeast Texas region, which is desert mountains, and it looks a little like Afghanistan, actually. But yeah, that's where I grew up, and it's where my family still mostly is. And went to public schools and didn't learn a thing. Went to Texas Tech University, didn't learn a thing. I worked gazillion jobs growing up. I always loved to work. And in fact, I would credit my work experience for almost everything. Until I became a junior in college when I went to Howard Payne University at MacArthur on MacArthur Academy scholarship, and they gave me everything for free, and I was able to, for 2 years, not work. But by this time, I was actually very interested in learning something. So I just camped out in the library for a couple of years, and that was awesome. And after that, I went to a journalism program in Washington, D.C., which exposed me sort of to the world of politics, and worked at the Center Press Gallery and that sort of thing. After that, went to work for Ron Paul for a couple of years. And 2 years? Oh yeah, maybe. And then entered graduate school at George Mason University in the PhD program and did not finish, but I was economics. So that's economics has always been the focus of my study, but I've always also been interested in the history of ideas, history of politics, history in general, sociology, psychology, everything else.
It's an extensive background. Your new book, Right-Wing Collectivism.
Yeah.
This is your fifth book?
Yeah, maybe sixth or seventh, depending on how you consider them. Yeah.
Okay, tell us a little bit about your new book.
Well, so the purpose of the book is really to, it will extend from a frustration I had that people today are not aware of what statism and collectivism looks like when it's packaged in an anti-leftist sort of cultural format or rubric. And they're unaware of what is in fact one of the great, most successful political movements of the 20th century, which goes by various names: fascism, Nazism, whatever. They don't know what that looks like or what it consists of, because after World War II, after we vanquished the enemy, it kind of went underground, and today people are unaware of it. So when we've seen the rise of the fascist right in Europe and the United States, unfortunately, many people are just confused. It's not just the libertarians, it's everybody. People just don't know what it means when a guy comes up to the podium and says, we really need to have national self-sufficiency in economics, and all of our problems are caused by foreigners, and we need to restrict immigration, and there's lots of dog whistling about culture and nation and race. Combined with a kind of an advertised dictatorship complex, if you give me all the power, I'll manage everything perfectly, that sort of thing. And people look at that and go, huh, that's weird. That's a lot of weird ideas. Oh well, move on. Well, I was curious myself, like what is the heritage of this body of thought? It looks more and more like a body of thought. So I just began to write essays about the topic, and I found one line that Ludwig von Mises had tossed off during an election in 1956. He said, George Friedrich Hegel had ruined German philosophy for a century. There were both left and right-wing branches of Hegelianism. The left-wing branch of Hegelianism landed in Marxism. The right-wing version of Hegelianism landed in Hitler. Okay, so he moves on. Okay, that blew my mind. Wow, is it really that? I mean, is that the intellectual heritage? And so I began to investigate, and of course he was right. And through leaving a bunch of breadcrumbs, I was able to discern the development of a tradition of thought that began with Johann Fichte and Hegel the 19th century and marched all the way into England and to the United States through the work of Frederick List in the US, who was a trade theorist, and Thomas Carlyle in England, who was a celebrator of the great man theory of history. Uh, Traveled through the eugenic and racialist movement of the late 19th century, and that's some harrowing reading. And then you bump up into the progressive era, and the progressive era really just, the progressives broke into the left progressives and right progressives. They're all just had this big demographic fear. I wanted to know where this stuff came from, why it emerged, why people found it compelling, and I traced it all the way up to the end of World War II in the book. The purpose is to sharpen people's instincts, ideological instincts, so we know what we're dealing with. To be against the left is not necessarily to be for freedom. There's right and left-wing versions of totalitarianism. And so that's what the book argues, and I specifically explore the rightist version, because that's the part that probably everybody talks about. I mean, I think you and I and almost everybody else active in liberty circles is very aware of the left and what it's about, right? But we're less attentive to the threat from the right because we don't understand it. The purpose of my book is to help us understand it.
Of the great philosophers, who would you say was the most influential to the liberty movement?
Well, it depends on what you want to consider the liberty movement, but I would trace it back 500 years. In fact, I like the word liberalism generally because it's a global term and it is really what we're talking about. And I would say certainly Anglo-Saxon tradition, there's nobody compares with John Locke. In the continental tradition, it was the late scholastics, successors to St. Thomas Aquinas, working out of Spain. In the U.S., I mean, we all know it's Thomas Jefferson, the great liberal. So I think those are the kind of founding fathers of this worldview. And what is the worldview? What does it really consist of? And it's the belief that if you leave society alone, then you're going to get more prosperity, more dignity, more human rights, and people are going to live better lives. I mean, that's really all it comes down to. It's not complicated.
What impact did Germany and World War II have on the libertarians of the early 20th century?
Well, let's see. Now, so World War II is mid-century, and you asked about earlier century, so it's a little bit of a complicated question. But I can say this. The libertarians that were alive during World War II became profoundly aware of this left-right Hegelian problem, that these are sort of different colors, different iterations of the same ideology. So, for example, in 1944, right at the end of the war, just as Allied troops were marching into territories previously occupied by the Nazis and finding thousands and thousands of death camps that traumatized a whole generation, in 1944 we had three really important books come out by the greats, Hayek, Mises, and John T. Flynn. And all three of them had the same theme. The threat to liberty comes from unexpected places. And if you're going to fight the right using left-wing methods, you're going to recreate fascism. If you're going to fight socialism with right-wing methods, you're going to recreate fascism. This is an impossible sort of biliou game, bouncing between the two forms of authoritarianism. What we really need to do is recapture the original liberal vision. All three of those books said the same thing. And that generation knew what they were talking about, right? And so Ayn Rand follows up, in 1956 with Atlas Shrugged, and Mises in 1949 writes Human Action, and so on. Those are the years in which what we call libertarianism today, really sharpened its sensibilities. And unfortunately, it's sort of the nature of the human person that we can only think in terms of one generation, or at most two, because we know our parents, right? And there's a gap of knowledge that emerges at some point between the 1940s and the present day. And it's unclear to me exactly why it is we lost this wisdom. But I have a theory that in the 1970s, libertarianism became overly rationalistic, overly sanitized, and overly codified. And we adopted this word libertarianism. Actually, it was first floated in 1956, you know, as kind of a leftover from late 19th century socialist anarchism. Nobody was using it, so the American liberals, the real liberals, picked it up, started using it. And it detached ourselves from our tradition and our history. And we began to think of libertarianism as a kind of overly Cartesian idea, where everything is worked out and modular, and like a set of policy proposals we impose on the world. We can sit back in our armchairs and figure out how everything works using the NAP. And that is not actually the liberal heritage at all. It's something weird, and I think that detachment from our tradition is precisely what gets us into trouble.
I want to ask you about Mussolini.
Yeah.
Where did Mussolini see the role of the state, and what can we learn about that in today's society?
Mussolini was a a fascinating figure because he was a dictator and a bully. He was mainly dedicated to eliminate his political enemies, but he outsourced his philosophy to this very funny man named Giovanni Gentile, who was the most liberal of all the fascists at the time. I mean, he didn't hate the Jews. He had no genocidal desires to demographically plan or exterminate anybody. He just thought being a fascist was just to be a sort of a manly man and to promote industry or something like that. I mean, and so he ghostwrote all of Mussolini's work. So the funny thing is that in the early 1930s, the U.S. academic press is constantly commissioning articles by Mussolini because he was very fashionable. I mean, the New York Times was running big articles, praising him. He was featured on the cover of the New York Times Magazine as Professor Mussolini in front of his chalkboard. I mean, it's unbelievable. So this poor dude, Giovanni Gentile, is ghostwriting all these articles, and most of which I've read, and I've read his book and everything. It's a little bit incoherent. Mussolini himself grew out of a syndicalist tradition and realized that he couldn't sell syndicalist socialism in Italy, because there's three things that people really like in Italy: their family, their religion, and their property. Well, syndicalist socialism of the sort that he was trying to sell was trying to get rid of all three. So he just kind of adapted it to purposes of Italian politics.
For someone who's never heard of the term, how would you describe, or what is Keynesian economics, and how does it affect the world we live in?
Keynesian economics was symptomatic of the time. Actually, in many ways, it's fascist economics. I mean, it emerges in the late 1920s and early 1930s with the extraordinarily unprincipled English aristocrat John Maynard Keynes, later Lord Keynes, who apparently was something like 6'6" and stunningly dashing, and his erudition used to just like take over every cocktail party. He could just walk into a room and dazzle people. That he apparently had a charm that I mean, last time I met with Gottfried Haberler, who was a student of his, and Haberler was actually an opponent of Keynes's theories, but he was so romantically attached to him as a person. Like, he had very fond views, and made me sit by his bedside as he was dying to read letters of John Maynard Keynes. It was one of the most grim tasks I ever faced.
How would you define the connection between libertarianism and anarchism?
Well, I think libertarianism has to imagine the possibility of anarchy, which is not to say that we have a plan for getting there, or that we're sure it's going to create some sort of utopia. But I would say that every good libertarian tries to imagine how the world works in the absence of power. Right? So, like, Hayek was once asked the question, what would happen to society if the state were abolished tomorrow? And his answer was very interesting. He said, not really anything. Not really that much. And that's a pretty good answer, I think.
What similarities and differences do you see between the Obama administration and the Trump administration?
Different policy priorities for sure. But so here's the problem. A lot of the Obama administration advertised itself one way and behaved another. So it was always advertising itself as multicultural, defending minority rights, universalist, and in favor of peace, and humanitarianism, whatever. You actually look at it, it was a warmongering. It perpetuated a lot of the most terrible policies of the Bush administration. And then Trump comes along, and he's a bully, he's a protectionist, he's a nativist, he's an authoritarian. But there's not that much difference between what Trump has did and what Obama has done in practice, really. I don't really think there's much difference, unless you want to put a lot of premium and value on sort of advertising. I think the U.S. is more popular around the world with Obama, and maybe that counts for something. I don't really know.
And you've done some speaking in Australia.
Yeah.
What's the political climate like there?
Everybody's ridiculously friendly. I love Australia. My God, it's the most, except for the drop bears. It's a wonderful place to be. However, the banning of gun rights was a mistake and really annoyed a lot of people. It actually doesn't make any sense. In fact, I don't believe it's going to be sustainable. Otherwise, Australia ranks higher on the index of freedom than the U.S. I mean, just in general, things are really chill. They're in a deregulatory mode in every area except for guns.
Do you see a libertarian president in our lifetime?
I hope not. I think it would probably be the most corrupt administration in U.S. history, actually. Yeah. So no, I don't want a libertarian president. Unless you mean LP. There's reasons why a third party can never win the presidency under a democratic system where you have a first past the post majority rule, winner take all. I mean, people will never support a third party under those conditions. I mean, at least third party support will always be very small. There's the only law of political science that political scientists have ever bothered to enumerate. So there's that fact. The other thing is that I worry so much about libertarians involved in politics. I think everybody is subject to corruption, and to me, statecraft is something that is a very difficult job to do, and sometimes libertarians imagine that they could do it just because they believe the right things. I don't believe that. I think it'd be a real mess. Yeah.
What do you think about the rise of Antifa?
I think it's every time you find fascism, you're going to find communism. Whenever you find communism, you're going to find fascism. They just go together. I mean, to me, these are just mirror images. I mean, the alt-right, Charlottesville marchers, and the bandana-clad, smashers of windows, and they're actually a dangerous bunch. I mean, yeah, it's just the rise of intolerance in general. I mean, I don't hang around in lefty circles, but my center-left friends are terrified of Antifa. I mean, my center-left friends feel about Antifa the same way National Review conservatives feel about the rise of the alt-right. They find them disgusting, distorted images of the worst aspects of their ranks that have been elevated into a kind of a primacy and a public presence by virtue of their extremism and their audacious public displays of violence.
Two more questions. What do you see as the free market solution to the questions on immigration?
Well, yeah. So I'm an open borders guy, but let me add a big however there. So the key to freedom is that it allows heterogeneous populations to get along and do well with each other. The problem is when you have a large-scale welfare state, people start resenting it when they're taxed to support lifestyles that are disconnected from their own cultural identity, and it leads to a kind of a rise of an anger like we've seen in this country. And I think that's very dangerous, actually, because it leads to police state tactics and that sort of thing. These crackdowns on immigration are really, it's very grim for the U.S. and I don't like it at all. So, like, ideally, I favor a free immigration system with no welfare provision whatsoever. I am concerned about the political implications of doing something in the U.S. like, for example, happened in Germany after the Syrian refugee crisis. I mean, it's actually a problem when you destabilize people to the point, whether they are mythically or not, when people believe that their country is being invaded by people who are unlike themselves. You see the rise of political intolerance. So I think this is something very important to keep in mind, actually. In other words, it's not just about what I would like, which I love a diverse society. I love a tolerant society. But I don't think everybody, the American bourgeoisie is not of that mindset right now. And it very much concerns me that just wholesale immigration that's unconscious of these kind of cultural factors will lead to rise of dangerous political movements. That said, there's certain things that U.S. could do right now to fix a lot of problems. One is I'd love to see the H-1B visa program massively expanded. Trump is shrinking it. The other thing is I'd like to see the rise of private refugee assistance. The U.S. is weird. We have a system where all refugees are they have to be let in by the U.S. State Department. We have no private refugee programs here. The exception is the Jewish refugee program, where you have a limited number of refugees allowed through a nonprofit charity. But apart from that, if I wanted to sponsor somebody from Ukraine or Mongolia or whatever, just because I have an interest in that, I'm not permitted to do that. Everything has to go through the State Department. So in effect, our refugee program is nationalized, which annoys the hell out of people, because then you get government choosing who is and isn't a refugee. Bring them over here at taxpayer expense, and then move them around like Mao or something to plant them in weird spaces around the country. They look in Indiana and go, oh, there's a town, there's not a lot of people. Let's put 9,000 Syrians there. Plop. I mean, what? This is central planning. And no surprise, it annoys people.
All right, last question, and this is a two-part question, possibly the most difficult question.
Mm-hmm.
Who is your favorite musician and or composer, and what is your favorite cocktail?
Oh, wow, yeah. Okay, musician, composer. So as soon as you said that, two names came to mind. One modern, post-World War I, and one 19th century. The modern one is Bill Evans, the pianist who used to play with Miles Davis, who played on the Kind of Blue album, and then went on to make another 40 albums. But the lyric quality of his playing, it's just, he was very few pianists were able to create that kind of improvisatory arc of phrase that he did, phrase within phrase, arc within arc. It somehow manages to be restlessly creative without being eccentric. And that description, to me, applies perfectly to Johannes Brahms, who was the late 19th century composer in Germany, whose music is the same way. It barely begins when it starts changing, I mean, the development was baked into the existence of the music itself. The beautiful thing about Brahms is that in those days in Germany, there were two parties. The Liberal Party favored free trade, property rights, small Germany, and freedom generally, the Goethe vision. And then you had the emergent, social welfare, Bismarckian conservatives, the rightist, build up, did the Prussian state model, right? So they had their composer, Wagner. The liberals had their composer, Brahms. So every time I hear Brahms, I hear liberals, and it inspires me. As for cocktails, let me tell you, I'm really, this is 2017. I think at the beginning of the year, a lot of us were panicked about politics, and many of us were drinking the drink of pirates, rum, because we are imagining ourselves as exiles within our own country. But as we approach the fall and the winter, I think we're gaining a greater clarity, and we're getting a little more firm in our views, and we're seeing that there's a way out of this mess. And to me, the answer to that is very obvious: cold gin with a squeeze of lemon.
All right, Jeffrey Tucker, thank you for talking with us today.
It's my pleasure.
Thanks for watching, everybody. If you want to support videos like this, please go to the link attached and donate $1. Thank you.